Okay, so just run through the hyperbola. So the basic equation of the hyperbola is y equals 1 over x. With this, if you look at this equation here, basically the x value can never equal 0, because if you put x equals 0 into the equation, it is undefined. And the y value also can't equal 0. Because if you get the x and the y and you swap it, like you multiply it, that's divided by x, and you multiply at the top, you get x times y equals 1. And if you look at that, then x equals 1 over y, because if it's times y, if you divide by y, it'd be 1 over y. Y also can never equal 0. And if you think about that too, if x can't equal 0, there's no value of x that you can put in there where you're going to get 0. Now, x equals 0 is the y-axis, and y equals 0 is the x-axis. Okay. Now, when you're sketching this curve, if you look at the curve, and let's just say we put in x equals a half, then we'd have y equals 1 over a half, and you flip it and you get 2. So when you're equal to a half, you're at 2, say there. So that point's a half, 2. If you put in x equals 1, you get y equals 1 over 1, which is 1. So when x equals 1, y equals 1. When you put in 2, y equals 1 over x, so it's 1 over 2, which is a half. So you can see the curve comes down and looks a bit like that. And when you put in x equals, let's just say minus a half, you're just going to have the opposite effect. So y is 1 over minus a half, which is minus 2. It's minus 1, minus 2, minus a half. It's going to be like, minus 2, so it's going to be down there. And then if you put in x equals minus 1, you're going to get y equals 1 over minus 1, which is minus 1, so it's going to be minus 1, and then it's going to be 2 minus a half. So the curve's going to look like that. And that's your basic shape of your hyperbola. Now you notice that it never ever cuts the x-axis. It'll keep going and get smaller and smaller, because you think about it, if you put in x equals say 100, you get y equals 1 over 100, and 1 over 100 is very, very small. You put 1,000, it's 1 over 1,000, so it'll get closer and closer to this axis, but it'll never actually cut it, because it'll never ever ever equal 0. And the same if you went this way as well, it'll never equal 0. And if you put in anything in here, as you get closer and closer to 0, like let's just say you put in x equals 1 over, let's just say 1,000, then y would be 1 over 1,000. It'd flip and give you 1,000. So it gets very big, but it never actually ever hits that axis. And that's why x can never equal 0 and y can never equal 0. The axis is called, these are called asymptotes. This one's the x-axis is an asymptote. It's the line that the curve gets closer and closer to, but never cuts. And the y-axis is also an asymptote. Okay. So an asymptote is the line that the curve gets closer to, but it never actually cuts. And the x and the y-axis are the asymptotes in this case, because the curve is getting closer to them, but it's never actually cutting them or meeting them. And if you look at this, that's what's happening there. There's one asymptote, the x-axis, and the other asymptote is the y-axis. Okay, so this affects the domain and the range. So the actual domain, you're looking at the domain, the values of x that it's true for. Like if you look at this, you have curve all the way up here. So you have curve here, but you don't have it when x equals 0. And you have all the way here, but you don't have it when x equals 0. So when you're actually getting the domain here, it's a funny way of writing it. You can go from minus infinity to 0, and you go from 0 to infinity. Because the x equals 0 is the only value it won't equal. And when you're looking at the range, if you look at the range on here, the range is the values of y it's not true for. Now you have y curve just up here. I'll just get rid of that. So you have y here. But as you notice, you don't have y along the x-axis when y equals 0, because y will never equal 0. And you have curve here for the negatives as well. So when you're looking at the range is the values of y for which it is true. So it's all of the y, so all the negative y up to 0, and then it'll be 0 to infinity.